first shell screamed overhead just after dawn, its whistle cutting through the February silence like a blade through flesh. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann pressed himself deeper into the frozen earth, feeling the ground shudder as the explosion erupted 200 meters to his left. Then came another, and another. The bombardment had begun, and with it, the terrible certainty that they were trapped. Klaus had known this feeling before, in the ruins of Stalingrad 2 years earlier. The same tightening in his chest, the same metallic taste of fear on his tongue, the same recognition that the noose was closing. He pulled his greatcoat tighter against the bitter wind sweeping across the Dnieper River and watched the younger men scramble for cover, their faces pale with the dawning realization of their predicament. Gefreiter Wilhelm Becker, Willie to those who knew him, dropped into the shallow trench beside Klaus, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. At 19, he still carried the softness of youth in his features, though the Eastern Front had already begun carving away at that innocence. His hands trembled as he gripped his rifle, knuckles white against the dark wood. The artillery barrage intensified, a rolling thunder that seemed to shake the very sky. Snow and frozen mud erupted in geysers of black earth, raining down on the German positions like a deadly hail. Klaus counted the seconds between impacts, calculating distances, estimating the number of guns the Soviets had brought to bear. Too many, far too many. Unteroffizier Ernst Müller appeared through the smoke and snow, his medic's bag bouncing against his hip as he ran in a crouch. He slid into the trench with practiced efficiency, his weathered face creased with concern. Ernst was older than most, pushing 40, with steady hands and eyes that had seen too much suffering to be shocked by anything anymore. Or so Klaus had thought, until he saw the worry etched in the medic's expression now. They. 3 men huddled together as the earth convulsed around them. Between explosions, they could hear the distant rattle of machine gun fire, the crack of rifles, and something worse, the sound of Soviet tanks grinding forward through the snow. The encirclement was complete. Over 60,000 German soldiers trapped in a pocket along the Dnieper, surrounded by an enemy that outnumbered them and held every advantage. Klaus pulled out his diary, a battered leather-bound book he had carried since the war's beginning. His fingers, stiff with cold, struggled to grip the pencil as he wrote in cramped script. The words came slowly, each one a small act of defiance against the chaos surrounding them. He wrote of the morning's first light, of the moment when the radio crackled with the news they had all feared. No relief column was coming, no breakout had been authorized, no escape route remained open. They were to hold their positions, they were to wait for orders, they were to trust in the Reich's promises of rescue. Klaus had heard such promises before, whispered through static-filled radios in Stalingrad's frozen ruins. He knew their worth. As the bombardment paused, the men emerged from their holes like creatures surfacing from underground burrows. Hauptmann Weber, their company commander, moved among them with purposeful strides, his face a mask of determination that fooled no one. He barked orders, organized defensive positions, spoke of duty and honor and the inevitable counterattack that would break the Soviet ring. Klaus watched him and saw a man trying to convince himself as much as his troops. Young Hans Schmidt appeared, barely 17 despite his forged papers claiming otherwise. His helmet sat too large on his head and his uniform hung loose on his thin frame. He carried ammunition boxes to the machine gun positions, his movements quick and nervous like a rabbit sensing wolves in the forest. Klaus felt a pang of something, pity perhaps, or recognition of his own younger self before the war had burned away such naivete. The men began digging in earnest as the brief respite ended and shells resumed their terrible work. They carved deeper into the frozen ground, creating a network of trenches and foxholes that would be their homes for however long the siege lasted. The earth resisted, frozen solid beneath a thin layer of snow, and pickaxes rang against it like bells tolling for the dead. Willie spoke of his village in Bavaria, of his mother's kitchen and the smell of fresh bread, of the girl who had promised to wait for him. Ernst listened and nodded, offering his own memories of peacetime, a medical practice in Hamburg, a wife and 2 daughters, Sunday walks along the Elbe. Klaus remained silent, letting their words wash over him, knowing that such talk was necessary, that hope was a ration as vital as bread or ammunition. But he also knew, with the certainty born of experience, that hope was the cruelest ration of all. It sustained you just long enough to make the inevitable end more bitter. The pocket was shrinking already, 40 kilometers across today, but tomorrow, next week, the Soviets would squeeze and squeeze until nothing remained but a final desperate struggle. Klaus closed his diary as darkness fell and the temperature plummeted. Around him, 60,000 men settled into their frozen positions, each one trapped in hell's waiting room, each one wondering if they would see another dawn. The pocket shrank like a dying animal curling in on itself. What had been 40 kilometers of contested ground became 30, then 25, then 20. Each day brought the Soviet lines closer, their artillery more accurate, their noose tighter around the throats of the trapped German forces. Klaus marked the shrinking perimeter on his map with a stub of pencil, watching the circle contract like a pupil exposed to harsh light. The supplies went first. Ammunition became precious as gold, rationed out in handfuls rather. Then boxes. Klaus's company received 30 rounds per man, then 20, then 15. The machine gunners hoarded their belts like misers, firing only when targets presented themselves in clusters. The artillery fell silent entirely, their guns useless monuments without shells to feed them. Food disappeared more slowly but more cruelly. The daily ration shrank from meager to starvation: a piece of hard bread, a cup of thin soup made from snow, and whatever scraps could be scavenged. And began eyeing each other's portions with predatory intensity. Klaus caught Willie hiding a crust of bread in his coat pocket, saw the shame and defiance warring in the young man's eyes. He said nothing. They were all becoming animals, reverting to base instincts as civilization's veneer cracked and peeled away. The wounded accumulated in numbers that defied comprehension. Ernst worked in a converted barn that had become a charnel house masquerading as a field hospital. The structure offered minimal shelter from the cold, its walls riddled with shrapnel holes that whistled with wind. Inside, men lay in rows on the frozen ground, their breath forming clouds that mingled with the steam rising from their wounds. Klaus and Willie helped Ernst when they could, holding down screaming soldiers while the medic worked with instruments that should have been sterilized but were merely wiped clean between patients. The morphine had run out days ago. Now amputations happened with nothing but a leather strap clenched between teeth and strong hands pinning down thrashing limbs. The first amputation Klaus assisted with haunted him. A young corporal, his left leg shattered by shrapnel from knee to ankle, the bone visible through torn flesh that had begun turning black with gangrene. Ernst laid out his saw with steady hands while Klaus and Willie positioned themselves at the man's shoulders and remaining leg. The corporal's eyes were wide, white-rimmed with terror, his breath coming in hyperventilating gasps. Ernst worked quickly, but not quickly enough. The screaming started immediately, a sound that seemed to originate from somewhere beyond human capacity for expression. It went on, rising and falling in waves that matched the rhythm of the saw's teeth biting through bone. Klaus pressed his full weight down, feeling the man's muscles convulse beneath him, feeling his own stomach heave with each stroke of the blade. When it ended, the sudden silence felt more terrible than the screaming had been. They performed 6 more amputations that day. By the third, Klaus had learned to disconnect his mind from his body, to let his hands do what was necessary while his thoughts fled elsewhere. By the 6th, he felt nothing at all. The psychological deterioration spread through the pocket like contagion. Minor disputes over rations escalated into fistfights, then knife fights. Klaus witnessed 2 soldiers from a neighboring company nearly kill each other over a handful of frozen peas. Hauptmann Weber tried to maintain discipline through force of will and threat of court-martial, but his authority eroded with each passing day. What did courts-martial matter when they were all likely to die or be captured anyway? The suicides began in the 2nd week. An officer from the artillery, his gun silent and useless, walked calmly to the edge of the perimeter and shot himself through the temple. A sergeant major hanged himself from a barn rafter using his own belt. Each death rippled through the pocket, spreading despair like poison in water. Klaus found himself understanding the impulse, feeling its dark attraction. To choose one's own end rather than wait for the Soviets to choose it for you, there was a certain logic to that, a final assertion of control in a situation where control had become illusion. The Soviet loudspeakers started on the 10th day. Massive speakers mounted on trucks beyond the German lines broadcast messages in perfect German, the voices warm and reasonable and utterly obscene in their false kindness. They promised hot food, medical care, warm beds for those who surrendered. They described the futility of continued resistance, the inevitability of defeat, the mercy that awaited those who laid down their arms. Some men listened with dangerous intensity. Klaus saw the temptation working in their faces, saw them calculating odds and weighing the propaganda's promises against the certainty of their current misery. Most knew better. The fate of German prisoners in Soviet hands was well understood, spoken of in whispers and confirmed by occasional glimpses of emaciated figures being marched eastward. But hunger and cold and hopelessness could make even the most obvious lies seem worth considering. Willie grew quieter each day, his youthful energy draining away like water through cupped hands. He stopped talking about Bavaria, about his mother's kitchen, about the girl waiting for him. Instead, he stared at nothing, his rifle held loosely in hands that had developed a constant tremor. Klaus tried to reach him with words of encouragement, with memories of past battles survived, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. Ernst aged visibly, his face becoming gaunt and lined, his hands developing a shake that made his surgical work increasingly difficult. He counted the dead obsessively, keeping a tally in a small notebook that he consulted constantly. 217, 218, 219. The numbers climbed with mechanical inevitability. Then came the rumor, spreading through the pocket like wildfire through dry grass. A breakout, a desperate push through a narrow corridor to reach German lines. The High Command had finally authorized it, a massed assault to punch through the Soviet encirclement before the pocket collapsed entirely. 4 kilometers of hell to traverse, but 4 kilometers that ended in safety, in survival and escape from this frozen trap. Hope flickered. The life in faces that had forgotten how to hope. Men cleaned their weapons with renewed purpose, checked their ammunition, prepared themselves mentally for what was coming. Klaus watched this transformation with the weary cynicism of experience. He had seen such hope before in Stalingrad, had watched it burn bright and then gutter out in blood and failure. But even he felt something stirring in his chest, some stubborn refusal to accept the alternative. Perhaps this time would be different. Perhaps they would make it through. Perhaps survival was possible after all. He wrote in his diary that night by the light of a guttering candle, his words careful and measured. He described the coming breakout, the narrow corridor of escape, the terrible gamble they were about to take. He did not write about his doubts, about the memories of Stalingrad that whispered warnings in his mind. Instead, he wrote about duty and necessity and the slim chance of seeing another spring. The entry ended with a single sentence, stark and unadorned: tomorrow we attempt the impossible. Dawn came reluctantly on February 16th, the sky bleeding from black to gray without ever achieving true light. Klaus stood in the assembly area, surrounded by thousands of men pressed shoulder to shoulder in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath creating a fog that hung over the mass like the exhalation of some massive, dying beast. The temperature had dropped to 20 below zero, cold enough that metal burned bare skin, cold enough that the snow beneath their boots squeaked with each step. The corridor lay ahead, invisible in the darkness but present in every man's mind, 4 kilometers of open ground between Soviet positions, a narrow passage through hell that represented their only chance of survival. Klaus had studied the hastily drawn maps, memorized the landmarks that would guide them through. A destroyed farmhouse at the 1-kilometer mark, a burned-out tank at 2 kilometers, a small grove of shattered trees at 3, beyond that German lines and safety, assuming they lived long enough to reach them. Willie stood to Klaus's left, his face pale and drawn in the dim light. The young man had barely slept, spending the night checking and rechecking his equipment with obsessive intensity. His rifle was spotless, his ammunition pouches arranged with geometric precision, his boots laced and relaced until the leather groaned. Klaus recognized the behavior, the desperate need to control something, anything, when control had become an illusion. Ernst appeared through the crowd, his medic's bag bulging with whatever supplies he had managed to scavenge. The bag seemed impossibly heavy, dragging at his shoulder, but the medic refused to lighten it. Each bandage, each tourniquet, each precious vial of medicine might mean the difference between life and death for someone in the hours ahead. Klaus saw the determination in Ernst's face, the stubborn refusal to abandon his calling even as the world collapsed around them. The artillery barrage began at precisely 5:30, German guns that had hoarded their remaining shells for this moment suddenly roaring to life. The sound was immense, a physical force that pressed against eardrums and chest cavities. Orange flashes lit the darkness as shells screamed overhead, impacting Soviet positions with thunderous detonations. For 10 minutes the barrage continued, attempting to suppress the enemy guns, to create a window of opportunity for the breakout. Then silence fell, sudden and absolute, and in that silence came the order to advance. The mass of men surged forward like a wave breaking against a shore. Klaus moved with them, swept along by the momentum of thousands of bodies pressing from behind. The snow was knee-deep, sometimes deeper, and the going was immediately exhausting. Men stumbled and fell, were trampled by those behind them, disappeared beneath the churning mass of boots and bodies. The military order that had existed in the assembly area evaporated within minutes, replaced by a primal surge towards survival. The Soviet artillery opened fire before they had covered 500 meters. The first shells landed in the center of the corridor, erupting in geysers of snow and frozen earth and human flesh. Klaus threw himself flat, felt the concussion wave pass over him like a physical blow, felt debris rain down on his back. He rose and pushed forward, stepping over a body that had been torn in half, the torso separated from the legs by a meter of crimson snow. The corridor became a killing ground. Soviet guns positioned on the high ground to either side poured fire into the desperate masses below. Artillery shells landed with metronomic regularity, each explosion creating a crater filled with the dead and dying. Machine gun fire swept across the snow in scything arcs, cutting down men in rows. Mortars dropped from the sky with whistling shrieks, their fragments spreading death in expanding circles. Klaus lost sight of his unit within the first kilometer. The organization that had existed on paper dissolved completely in the chaos of fire and snow and blood. He found himself running alongside men he had never seen before, strangers united only by their desperate flight toward safety. A horse-drawn wagon careened past, its driver dead in the seat, the horses mad with terror and trailing their entrails through the snow. The wagon overturned, spilling supplies and wounded men who screamed for help that would never come. The destroyed farmhouse appeared through the smoke and snow, its walls pocked with shell holes, its roof collapsed into the interior. Klaus used it as a navigation point, adjusting his course slightly eastward. Bodies lay thick around the structure, men who had sought shelter there only to be caught by a direct hit. The snow was no longer white but red and black, churned into a slurry of blood and mud and worse things. Willie materialized beside him, the young man's face splattered with blood that was not his own. They ran together for a time, neither speaking, their breath coming in ragged gasps that burned their lungs. A shell landed 10 meters to their right, and Klaus felt the blast wave lift him off his feet and throw him forward. He landed hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs, his vision graying at the edges. When his sight cleared, Willie was gone, swallowed by the chaos as completely as if he had never existed. Klaus called out, his voice lost in the cacophony of explosions and screaming and the terrible whistling of incoming shells. He staggered forward, searching the faces of the men around him, but Willie had vanished into the maelstrom. At the 2-kilometer mark, Klaus found young Hans Schmidt. The boy lay in the snow beside the burned-out tank that served as a landmark, his legs shattered by shrapnel, the bone visible through torn flesh and uniform. His face was white with shock and pain, his lips moving in silent prayer or plea. When he saw Klaus, his eyes focused with desperate intensity. The boy reached up with one hand, fingers grasping at Klaus's coat. His voice was barely audible over the surrounding chaos, but Klaus heard the words clearly enough. "Help me please, don't leave me here." Klaus knelt beside him, his mind racing through impossible calculations. Hands weighed perhaps 60 kilograms, maybe more with his equipment. The corridor was still 2 kilometers long, 2 kilometers of open ground under constant fire. Carrying the boy would slow him to a crawl, would make him a stationary target for Soviet guns. They would both die certainly and quickly. But leaving him meant condemning hands to freeze to death in the snow, or worse, to capture by Soviet forces whose treatment of wounded prisoners was legendary in its brutality. Klaus looked into the boy's eyes and saw his own younger self, saw the person he had been before Stalingrad and the Eastern Front had burned away everything soft and human inside. The decision took seconds but felt like hours. Klaus reached down and pressed his pistol into Hans's hand, closing the boy's fingers around the grip. He leaned close, his lips near Hans's ear, and spoke words he would remember for the rest of his life. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Then he stood and ran, leaving Hans Schmidt behind in the snow with a loaded pistol and the terrible choice of how to use it. He did not look back, he could not look back. Behind him, a single shot rang out, barely audible in the greater symphony of death, and Klaus felt something inside himself break cleanly, like a bone snapping under too much weight. Ernst appeared through the smoke at the 3-kilometer mark, stopping to help a wounded man who had collapsed in the snow. Klaus grabbed the medic's arm and pulled him forward, screaming at him to move, to keep going, that they would all die if they stopped. Ernst resisted, trying to return to the wounded man, his face twisted with anguish and duty. Klaus hit him a sharp blow to the side of the head that stunned the medic into compliance, then dragged him forward by main force. They ran through the grove of shattered trees, the trunks splintered by artillery fire, the branches hanging like broken bones. Bodies hung in the trees, thrown there by explosions, their forms twisted into impossible positions. The snow beneath the trees was churned into a red mud that sucked at their boots, trying to hold them in place, to keep them in this killing ground forever. The final kilometer stretched endlessly, each step an act of will against exhaustion and terror and the overwhelming desire to simply lie down in the snow and let it end. Klaus's lungs burned with each breath, his legs trembled with fatigue, his vision narrowed to a tunnel focused on the ground ahead. Men fell around him constantly, cut down by machine gun fire or shrapnel, or simply collapsing from exhaustion and cold. Then, impossibly, German positions appeared ahead, trenches and bunkers, and soldiers in familiar uniforms reaching out to pull survivors to safety. Klaus stumbled the final meters and fell into a trench, his body finally giving out, his mind shutting down everything except the most basic functions. Ernst landed beside him moments later, and then Willie appeared, emerging from the smoke like a ghost, his face blank with shock. They lay together in the trench, 3 men who had survived Hell's Gate, covered in blood and mud and the filth of battle. Around them, other survivors collapsed, fewer than 40,000 of the 60,000 who had been trapped. The corridor behind them was carpeted with the dead, thousands of bodies frozen in their final moments of flight, a monument to desperation and the terrible price of survival. Klaus closed his eyes and saw Hans Schmidt's face, saw the boy's hand reaching up, saw the pistol pressed into his palm. The image would not fade, would not release him, would remain burned into his memory like a brand. He had survived, he had made it through. But the cost of that survival was measured in abandoned comrades and impossible choices, and the knowledge that he had left a boy to die alone in the snow. The bunker was warm, impossibly warm after weeks of frozen hell. Klaus sat wrapped in a wool blanket that someone had draped over his shoulders, but he could not stop shivering. The tremors came from somewhere deep inside, from a place that had nothing to do with temperature. Around him, other survivors huddled in similar states of shock, their eyes vacant, their bodies present but their minds still trapped in that corridor of death. A bowl of soup sat untouched in Klaus's hands, growing cold. The smell of it, real food, hot and nourishing, should have awakened desperate hunger, but instead it triggered nausea. He saw Hans Schmidt's face in the surface of the liquid, saw the boy's eyes wide with betrayal and terror. Every time Klaus tried to lift the spoon to his lips, his hand froze and the image intensified until he had to set the bowl aside or risk vomiting. Willie sat against the opposite wall, staring at nothing. The young man who had spoken endlessly of Bavaria and his mother's kitchen and the girl who waited for him now maintained absolute silence. His face had changed in ways that transcended the physical toll of starvation and exposure. The softness was gone entirely, replaced by something hard and broken, like glass that had shattered but somehow maintained its shape. He was 19 years old and looked 50, his youth burned away in 4 kilometers of hell. Ernst's hands would not stop shaking. The medic held them out before him, watching the tremors with clinical detachment as if they belonged to someone else. He had tried to help the wounded who arrived at the bunker, had moved automatically toward the aid station, but his hands betrayed him. The steady fingers that had performed amputations without anesthesia, that had tied off arteries and sutured wounds under fire, now could not hold a bandage without dropping it. Klaus watched Ernst count silently, his lips moving with each number. The medic had been counting since they arrived, tallying the men he could not save, the wounded he had left behind in the snow. The numbers climbed steadily, 217 became 300, then 400, then 500. Ernst counted the faces he remembered, the voices that had called for help, the hands that had reached out as Klaus dragged him forward through the corridor. Night fell, though time had become meaningless. Klaus attempted to write in his diary, pulling the battered leather book from his coat with hands that felt disconnected from his body. The pencil hovered over blank pages, but no words came. What could he write? How could he describe what they had done, what they had become? The diary had been a record of survival, but survival itself had become a form of death. He tried anyway, forcing the pencil to move, scratching out words that felt inadequate and obscene. He wrote about Hans Schmidt, about the pistol pressed into the boy's hand, about the single shot that had followed. He wrote about the faces in the snow, the bodies they had stepped over, the screams they had ignored in their desperate flight toward safety. The words came slowly, each one extracted like a tooth, each sentence a confession of sins that could never be absolved. Other survivors shared their stories in whispered fragments, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile shell protected them from complete collapse. The sergeant described leaving his wounded lieutenant behind, the officer's final words a curse that would echo forever. A corporal spoke of watching his best friend fall, of continuing to run without stopping, of the guilt that felt like a physical weight crushing his chest. Each story was a variation on the same theme, survival purchased with the currency of abandoned comrades and impossible choices. Hauptmann Weber appeared in the bunker entrance, his uniform cleaned and pressed, his bearing still military despite everything. He gathered the survivors and delivered a speech about duty and sacrifice, about the necessity of their actions, about the honor of those who had fallen. His words were carefully chosen and utterly hollow, bouncing off the walls like stones thrown into a void. Klaus watched the captain's mouth move and heard nothing, the speech dissolving into meaningless noise. When Weber finished and departed, the silence that followed felt heavier than before. The captain's attempt at meaning-making had only emphasized the meaninglessness of it all. They had survived, yes, but what exactly had they survived for? To carry this guilt, to see Hans Schmidt's face every time they closed their eyes, to count the dead in endless tallies that could never be complete. Days passed in a blur of administrative processing and medical examinations. Doctors checked their frostbite, their malnutrition, their various wounds and injuries. No one examined the damage that could not be seen, the fractures that ran through their minds and souls. Klaus submitted to the examinations with passive compliance, answering questions in monosyllables, allowing himself to be poked and prodded and declared fit for continued service. He attempted to write a letter to Hans Schmidt's mother, sitting with pen and paper for hours, trying to find words that would explain what had happened to her son. How could he tell her that he had left the boy in the snow with a loaded pistol? How could he describe the choice he had made, the terrible mathematics of survival that had condemned her son to die alone? The letter remained unwritten, the paper blank except for "Dear Frau Schmidt" at the top, a salutation that led nowhere. Willi began speaking again in the second week, though his words came slowly and without inflection. He described his village in Bavaria as if reading from a guidebook, reciting facts about population and geography with no emotion attached. The girl who had promised to wait for him was never mentioned again. When asked about her, Willi's face went blank and he changed the subject with mechanical efficiency. Ernst's hands gradually steadied, the tremors diminishing to occasional shakes that came and went without warning. He returned to medical duties, working in a field hospital behind the lines, but something fundamental had changed. He moved through his tasks with grim efficiency but without the dedication that had defined him before. The medic who had refused to leave wounded men behind now performed his duties with cold professionalism, saving lives because it was his job, not because he believed in the sanctity of doing so. The new assignments arrived in the third week. Klaus, Willi, and Ernst were being separated, sent to different units across the Eastern Front. The military machine had no use for their bonds, no recognition of what they had endured together. They were simply replacements, bodies to fill gaps in depleted formations, soldiers to be deployed wherever the need was greatest. They met one final time before departing, standing in the cold outside the bunker where they had first arrived. No word seemed adequate to the moment. They had survived Hell's Gate together, had made choices that would haunt them forever, had paid prices that could never be calculated in any meaningful currency. What could they say to each other that would acknowledge all of that? Klaus extended his hand, and Willi took it, their grip brief and firm. Ernst clasped both their shoulders, his steadied hands conveying what words could not. Then they separated, walking in different directions toward different futures, bound forever by shared guilt and the knowledge that survival was not the same as living. Klaus wrote one final entry in his diary that night, his last words before departing for his new assignment. The entry was brief, stripped of the detail and observation that had characterized his earlier writing. He wrote about the price of living when so many had died, about the weight of choices made in moments of desperation, about the question that would follow him for whatever time remained. The entry ended with a single question, stark and unanswerable. Did we survive Hell's Gate, or did we simply trade one hell for another? He closed the diary and placed it in his pack, knowing he would never open it again. Some things were better left unexamined, some memories better left unwritten. The corridor was behind him, but Hans Schmidt's face remained, a ghost that would follow him through whatever battles lay ahead, a reminder that survival itself could be the cruelest punishment of all.